Thank you all for coming. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. We got about 45 minutes to an hour. I am Mike Orvis, and welcome to the Page Walker Hotel. This is a redo of a talk I gave at the library back on the 6th of August. And this is the third part of a three-part series about houses on the move in downtown Cary. This one, of course, is about the Ivey-Ellington. The first one was about the Nancy Jones house, Carla Jordan Michaels, here at the Page Walker gave that talk. If you don't know which one the Nancy Jones house is, if you're heading out of town toward the west on 54, there's Lowe's on your right, you're crossing Maynard. It's an old white house on the left. There's a little fence out in front of it. It's a two-story, 3-2-and-a-door house. That's an 1803 house, one of the oldest houses in Wake County. And that talk was archived and is online. You can go see it. You can find the link at the Friends of the Page Walker site. The other house on the move was the Williams house, a much less known house. If you know, on Chatham Street, just past the Perfect Peace on the right, there's a brand new cider bar. And there's a champagne bar, resting bitch face, something like that, down below, and a bridal shop. If you haven't been to the champagne bar, it's fabulous. All the drinks are named after the exes of the ladies who run the place. My wife has been, so it's a really fun place to go. So at any rate, the front of that building is the Williams house, which is an Art Deco building that's set a little bit further down Chatham Street. And this was entirely on the developer. They bought it, they moved it, they incurred the expense to save the house. The town owns the Nancy Jones house, and the town owns the Ivey-Ellington house. But the Williams house was saved by private money, which is kind of nice. And again, like the Nancy Jones house, Catherine Laughlin did the Williams house, and that was also online. So also many thanks to the Cary Public Library came to us and said, hey, let's have a talk about the houses in town that are moving. And so those of them volunteered, sure will give the talk, so many thanks to them. Also, I am forever grateful to the Friends of the Page Walker who work tirelessly to keep the stories of Cary's history alive, and I am humbled to be a very small part of that wonderful organization. So finally, I am not a historian by any stretch of the imagination. I worked with Billie Joe. She would say I'm barely a programmer. Historian. But I've tried hard to be as accurate as I can, but history is an ever-moving and evolving target. In fact, when I was writing this out back in June, there's a fact we'll get to later that this is what happened, this is the way it was. And that's wrong. We have found out since then that we were wrong about that, and we'll talk about that as we go through. Again, history is ever evolving. So let's talk a lot about the Ivey-Ellington, or as you might call it, that little white church on Chatham. But of course, if you're here, you probably know it was never a church. It was always a private residence. But the confusion and looking like a church is actually intentional. That was the style of the house. It's supposed to look like a church. But today, let's talk about the early history. Who built it, why it was built, when it was built, that kind of stuff. We'll talk about the architecture, which makes it a very unique structure in Cary and Wake County even. We'll talk about who owned the house over the years. For over 130 years, it was a private residence, and as you can imagine, there's a lot of stories that over 130 years of people living there can tell. We'll talk about why is it worth saving. If you're here, you know the house was moved, and it is going to be saved. But what I like to do, we'll do what we call a 30-second elevator speech. If somebody asks you, why should the Ivey-Ellington be saved? And you've got a 30-second spiel to tell them this is why the house should be saved. And finally, we'll talk about the future plans, what's going to become of the house now that it's going to be saved.
Can you explain, okay, I'm sorry, I don't know downtown Cary, where exactly did this house move to?
Okay, so I should have had, it's a good question, I should have had a map of downtown. The house sat on Chatham Street. If you're coming up Harrison toward downtown, turn left on Chatham, was right there.
Okay.
Keep going on Chatham, turn right on Academy. You know where the old library was?
Yeah.
It's right there.
Oh.
On the corner of the slot where the old library was.
Okay, because I saw some. So it's just going in now, right, or whatever?
It is there, it's there. It was moved in February, it is there. As a favorite fictional nun once said, let's start at the beginning, because it's a very good place to start. No Sound of Music fans, I wait for laughter. No, okay. I'm a big fan. Anyway, so talk a little bit about one slide about the history of Cary before it was Cary. The first known white settler in the area was a fellow named Nathaniel Jones, who received, Francis Jones, his father, received a land grant around 1749 for most of the land that encompasses downtown Cary, making him the first official white settler in the area. He had a son, Nathaniel Jones, who ended up owning most of the land in the western part of Cary. If you look at the map, just to the side of Bradford's Ward area where it says Captain Jones, That's actually the Nancy Jones house out on 54. That's where that one's set. We'll talk about Bradford's Ordinary in just a second. There was another Nathaniel Jones that lived in the eastern part of the area. In fact, Nathaniel Jones in the western part was referred to as Nathaniel Jones of Crabtree. Nathaniel Jones on the east side was referred to as Nathaniel Jones of White Plains. And if you look at deeds and documents from the era, it actually says Nathaniel Jones, White Plains, Nathaniel Jones, Crabtree, because they wanted to keep the two separately. Now, Carla covered the history of the Nancy Jones house in great detail, and it is a fabulous presentation. She's by far the best historian of our group and the best presenter, and it's absolutely worth going to watch that. So the two Joneses owned the east and the west part of Cary, basically, and as to be expected, sooner or later they got together. If you were at the cemetery tour, we saw his son and her daughter's grave, Henry Jones and Nancy Jones, whose house now we talk about there at Hillcrest Cemetery in Cary. So eventually, of course, the Joneses got married, they were joined, and I believe it was a family tradition that every third child had to be named Nathaniel. Because when you look back through the record, there are lots of Nathaniel Jones, which makes tracing things always lots of fun when they have the same name. So, now, things changed a bit around 1760s when John Bradford arrives and sets up an ordinary. You see Bradford's O-R-D there on the map. An ordinary is basically a little roadside pub, a little inn. You get something to eat, maybe spend the night. And the ordinary set right where Town Hall is, right now. That's where the ordinary set. John picked it out on the road and built it. William Jordan in the early 1800s, early 19th century, owned the house, but not a lot happened really in this area. It didn't get a lot of development until around the 1850s, and then something really big did happen. In 1854, North Carolina decided to lay the railroad between Goldsboro and Charlotte right through what was Bradford's Ordinary, right in front of that. The original plan had been to lay it about 5 miles north, but if you've been through Umstead Park, running a railroad through there is a really poor idea. The reason we're here is that the railroad was laid a little bit further south. Shortly after the road was announced the railroad was going to go through, a guy named Allison Francis Frank Page bought 300 acres of land centered around Bradford's Ordinary and set about building a town. Frank at heart was a businessman and a lumberman. He knew that we got all this virgin forest around here, the train track's going to run right through it, I can build a sawmill, I can build a house, and I can process this lumber and get it shipped to market, and that was his original plan. So he bought what was Bradford's Ordinary and expanded it into a house for his family. And there's a quote about Frank that I want to read so I don't mess it up. And Frank believed in God, high thinking, plain living, and hard work. His Methodism was of the most authentic Wesleyan brand. He would not allow employees to curse, and he did not approve of theater going, dancing, dicing, or card playing. But his most cherished abomination was alcoholic beverages. When Frank established Cary as a charter town in 1871, it was a dry town. You could not legally buy a drink in Cary until the early 1960s. So I sometimes wonder what Frank would think if he could stroll up and down Chatham Street now. But then I think, well, he also bought a bar basically to live in at his house, so maybe he was a little more free going like that. So Frank laid out roads, built his house to the family. So I built to the family a house. The rail line was completed in 1856, and that year Frank established a post office in Cary and set himself up as postmaster. Passenger train service began with a depot in 1867. Shortly after that, Frank set about building a grand 3-story hotel to sit in front of the railroad track to attract people coming off for a dinner and a place to stay. And that, of course, is where we're standing today. It was not the Page Walker Hotel, it was the Walker Hotel, because he hired a woman, Nancy Walker, to run the hotel for him. When it was restored in the 1980s, the name was changed to Page Walker, as in for honor for Frank, the town founder. He, as I say, incorporated Cary in 1871, set himself up as the first mayor, and we're off and on our way. For those who don't know, he picked Samuel Fenton Cary as the namesake for the town, who was a teetotaling Yankee general. And as a Southerner, that's hard for me to say, but nonetheless, that's what we got. Now, let's talk about the Ivey-Ellington. It's unclear if Frank himself actually authorized the building of the Ivey-Ellington or not, but he certainly had something to do with it, whether he was the instigator or not. So let's talk a little bit about Alonzo Crocker. It's a great picture. Again, history is seldom 100% certain, but these are things that we know. That in 1874, a fellow named Alonzo T. Mile, not Alonzo Crocker, Alonzo T. Mile, bought 4 acres on West Chatham Street from Frank Page, April of 1874. Mial was quite wealthy, and M-I-A-L, I'm not sure how to pronounce that name, I'm saying Mial, but it sounds like meow, like a cat, but I mean, whatever, M-I-A-L is what his name was. He was quite wealthy. He's from the Shotwell area over in the eastern part of the county, Wendell. There's no indication that Mial himself actually bought the house, built the house, but there is indication that he hired Alonzo Crocker to build the house. Now, neither Crocker, Mial, or Page ever actually lived in the house, but Crocker himself has quite a history, and he's worth talking about. He was born in 1846 in Wake Forest, known to be an expert machinist and carpenter. In fact, he built the original pews and lectern used at Cary First Methodist, right up there on Academy. That's the lectern, those are one of the pews that he built in the 1870s when the church was first founded. He was married 3 times, and all of his wives are buried in Hillcrest with him. He outlived his first 2 wives, had at least 10 kids, and some of them are buried with him in Hillcrest. But his first wife is the one that's really of interest to us. She was Susanna Rabbiteau, and her sister was Catherine Rabbiteau. Catherine was better known as Mrs. Frank Page. So Alonzo and Frank were brothers-in-law. So it's not unreasonable at all to think that Frank Page would have turned his brother-in-law, this very accomplished builder, hooked him up with this guy from out of town who wants to build a house in town. And a little more indication that Mial had really something to do with it is that he had built a Gothic Revival style church in the Wendell area, Shotwell area of Wendell. So Crocker himself, though, unfortunately only lived till 1901. He died 55 years old when he suffered a broken leg while working as foreman at the Cary Lumber Company. The death notice in the paper is interesting. They said he was doing fine, he was recovering, and then in a 10-minute period, he was just gone. He went from I'm feeling pretty good to 10 minutes later, he was out. So 1901. For those who are a little bit more interested in Cary history, his father was William Lancaster Crocker, who was principal at Cary Academy in the 1880s. So there's definitely a little family connection there. And he and his father are buried out in Hillcrest. But what exactly did he build? Everybody's familiar with the American Gothic, the painting by Grant Wood in 1930. And I love art. I love to talk about art. And whether this is satirical or he was really making a statement, we'll leave about that for another subject. But it is arguably the most famous picture of a Gothic Revival house in America. Because the painting is American Gothic. Gothic is the house. It's not the people. It's the American Gothic. And there are several things about the house that really signify it as an American Gothic house. Notice the pointed arch windows and steep roof. I'm going to talk about soffits and fascias a bit for those that don't know. The fascia is the front part on the edge just under the gutters. The soffit is the flat part underneath. The fascia is the face. It's the part you see. The soffit is up underneath. The deep set soffit is very indicative of a Gothic Revival house as well. And like this one, the fascias on the one that he painted are really quite plain, and I attribute that to being in Eldon, Iowa, where the Midwest is known for not being quite so dramatic with flair and plain. And that house actually still stands in Eldon, Iowa. It's worth seeing. But if we have American Gothic in Iowa, certainly we should have Cary Gothic here in Cary. Many thanks to Catherine Laughlin, too, the lady that gave the talk about the Williams House, and Matthew Champagne, whom we were terribly sorry to lose when he moved to Maryland to work at a different historic building up there. But they posed to the picture. The Friends own the cutouts, and once the Ivey-Ellington is back up and open to the public, we will occasionally have the cutouts out there, and you too can have your picture made with those. But the similarities between Ivey-Ellington and the house and Wood's painting are clear. I mean, there's the arched windows, the very steep roof, the vertical board and batten siding, the fancy fascias, the deep set soffits. By every stretch of imagination, it is a very classic 19th century Gothic Revival house. Now, the Gothic Revival style was very popular in the 19th century. But by the end of the third quarter or so of the 19th century, into the Civil War, it was starting to lose steam a little bit. But it was thought that this style signified an architectural form that focused on the changing attitudes of Americans toward nature, religion, technology, and family. They were often built with the most technologically advanced possible ways at the time. The Druid style, obviously, I think it's obvious I'll say anyway, that a Druid style from medieval architecture, the steep pointed roofs and the windows. Now, it's understanding that some folks would think it looks like a church, because it does, and it's supposed to look like a church. It's supposed to get you thinking. The way the windows point and the roof, it's supposed to point toward heaven. It's drawing your vision up. It's supposed to signify a very Christian dwelling. The style of promoted often as being appropriate design for rural settings, because the contrasting lines and sharp angles are supposed to fit in nicely with the natural rolling landscape. It was often chosen for country houses in small town settings. And Cary in 1874 was as country as you can get. But let's look at a couple inside pictures. There we go. So the house measures out at about 2,000 square feet. And unique to most 19th century houses, it is largely unchanged. No one has made any radical changes to the inside of the house since it was built. Nobody's moved a wall, or we'll talk in a minute about a couple of the additions that were made, but they were added to the side. They weren't added to the inside of the house. Now, along with the doors, mantle, so a lot of the stuff on the inside, the doors, the mantles, the flooring, the handrails, a lot of those are original. And if Alonzo Crocker did build the house, it's very likely that he built a lot of those pieces and parts by hand. I like the storage, little Harry Potter storage under the stairs. There we go. So there's a close-up of one of the doorknobs inside. And as Billy Joe mentioned when we were downstairs, one of the things I do when I'm away from this kind of fun stuff is I'm a wood turner. And so I looked at the knob, the newel posts, they turn on a treadle lathe by hand. I've actually once had the privilege to work on a treadle lathe, and you would have one really big leg by the time you were done with it. So I assume that Alonzo had some poor kid there just pounding away, and he's doing the hard work as an apprentice to do it. And again, the stuff on the inside is original. It's pretty cool. Yeah, but because of association with the church, again, like I say, it often signifies a Christian dwelling. And our house takes that even one step particularly further. Viewed from above, if you know what a cathedral looks like, it's clearly big. It's pretty darn obvious. But my laser pointer wouldn't work at the library, but here we are. This section on the side and the back were add-ons that were later. So just the main cross section was what was original to the house. We'll talk about the fellow that added the little kitchen in the back and the side porch. When the house was saved and moved, those pieces were torn off and were not put back on. They're not original to the house. So it's hard to imagine a better example of a 19th century Gothic revival house, in my opinion. So let's talk about who lived there. So history is seldom 100%. The first 20 years or so, there are definitely some questions about who lived there. The records are often incomplete, and some that are there are contradictory. We know that a Poole family lived there. Even, again, we're learning as we go. Very recently, a letter was uncovered from Rufus Jones, the grandson of Nathaniel Jones, who talked about Mr. Ivey, who just bought the house on Chatham. So there's a record showing that this fellow had bought the house, which is pretty cool. So we know that Thaddeus and Mary Esther Downer Ivey lived in for 5 years in the 1890s. Charles Romulus Scott lived in it after that. For a short period in 1918, a guy named Joseph Smith owned it. Harrison Ellington from 1918 to 1946. He has no connection with Harrison Avenue. That's named after Bob Harrison, a different fellow here in town. In 1946, H.H. Waddell buys the house, and in some form or another, it will remain in his family until 2011 when it's sold to the town of Cary, because his daughters inherited it from him, and one of his daughter's husbands, his son-in-law, inherited it from her when she passed away. And we'll talk about Eva Waddell Sugg and Melba, and we'll talk quite a bit about Jefferson Sugg, H.H.'s son-in-law. Let's talk about the Iveys, Thaddeus and Mary Ivey. Again, they were the first known confirmed residents of the house. Even though they only lived in the house for 5 years, their family had a large impact on the town. And it's always interesting to me how a house gets a name. They lived there for 5 years, and they're the first one who gets the name on the house. And there are people who live there much longer. I live in a house not far from here in downtown Cary that the Lewis family built in 1956, and they owned it until 2004. And it will forever be the Lewis house, no matter how long I live there. And that's okay. So now Thaddeus was born, he's not in Cary, he was born in Robeson County in 1855. He moved to Cary in 1891 from Raleigh to escape city life and raise his kids in the family. He thought Raleigh in 1891 was too much of a city for him. But he worked in Raleigh, and he still commuted to Raleigh. And by commute, I mean he would get up Monday morning, he'd walk across the street to the depot in front of the home, in front of the page of the Walker Hotel. He'd take the train to Raleigh. He'd do his work for the week. He'd come home Saturday night, take the train home. He spent Saturday night and Sunday night at home with his family. Get back on the train Monday, and back to Raleigh he would go. Thaddeus was a member of the Prohibition Party, so I like to think that he fit right into Frankstown.
Yeah, he did.
Yep. In 1898, he moved the family to Hillsborough for a short time, but then returned to Cary and bought a farm just west of Cary, as they call it, between the tracks. So there were two tracks in town by that time. They diverged over just west of here where Maynard, you can go on Maynard between the tracks. Right in that area, he built a farm and called it Ivy-Ellington. He worked as an RFD, that's Rural Free Delivery Mail Carrier, as did his son, and did occasionally marry herself. And by all accounts, part of the expression, Mary was hell on wheels with a horse and buggy. She loved to fly up and down through the roads, delivering mail, and just liked to go. So again, he had been born and raised on a farm, but around 1922, he sold Ivy-Ellington and bought a house on Academy Street. He wanted to live back in Cary. He bought, the house actually still exists. It's the corner of Park and Academy, and it was named the Raven House after Reverend Raven, the Methodist minister who first lived in the house. He bought the house again in 1922, but now he had a car, and he could drive himself back and forth to Raleigh. His daughter, Esther, had been born in 1890 when he was a student at Wake Forest College, and moved into the house with him at the time, and she lived there until she died in 1989. So in 1922 and 1989, she lived in that house. And it's worth talking about her just a little bit. There she is. Again, she was born in 1890, while her father was a student at Wake Forest. She graduated Cary High School in 1906 when it was still a private school. It had not been purchased by the county yet to become the first public high school in North Carolina, which is true. It was still a private school at the time. She graduated Guilford College, which was unusual for a woman at the time to go to school, and then got a job with the Baptist State Convention in 1919 and held this position until she retired in 1955. Again, she lived at the Raven House from 22 until her death in 1989 at the age of 99. The picture on the left, I love this picture for her, is from 1907, and on the back it says, 17 years old, photo taken at the Walker Hotel in Cary by a traveling photographer. And I would love to reach back in time and tell this guy, turn around, take a couple of pictures in town, and just want to see it. And the great thing about it is that maybe he did, and we just haven't found him yet. They could be out there, so the search continues. The older picture is from her on the front porch of her house on Academy Street. And she liked to tell the story that when she lived in the Ivey-Ellington house, there were real, honest-to-goodness cattle drives that happened in Cary. There were cattle farmers in Chatham County that would run their cattle to Raleigh to market. It was cheaper to drive them along the road than put them on the train. And so they would camp right in front of her house. They'd get water from the well. She talked about the Conestoga wagons, the chuck wagons, cowboys on horses, the whole 9 yards of them driving cattle right down Academy Street. They would occasionally drive turkeys as well. And she said the turkeys would, quote unquote, take to the trees at night. And they'd be out there the next morning shaking the trees, trying to get the turkeys out and herd them on down the road. So those drives continued even until the next people that owned the house. And one thing that Esther Ivey, she was called, was known for was making black lace. Now here's where history diverged on us for a minute. For the longest time, we told people that Esther Ivey was the inaugural founder of the Cary, North Carolina chapter of the Gourd Society of America. And that it became, it still is, it was a really big event. You have this gourd celebration through the 50s and 60s here. It got too big in the 60s. They moved it to the fairground. It still happens every year. In November, you can go to the gourd site. And we've told people for years that she was the founder of the Cary branch. That's not true. We have found out recently that it was someone else that actually founded the Cary Gourd Society. It was the gourd. It's hard to overstate how big gourds were. In 1964, Cary held a competition to design a new town seal. And on that town seal, there are gourds. And it says the gourd capital of the world right there on the town. When they remade the seal later, they took off gourd capital of the world. But the rim of it is still stylized curlies that if you know what you're looking at, they look like gourds. Now, if you're not sure exactly which house I'm talking about on the Raven House where she lived, this is what it looked like when she lived there. It's now Lena Addison Bridal Shop. It's right next to the Baptist church, and that was her house for a very long time. So let's talk about the next folks that owned it. Charles Romulus Scott, I think great name, Charles Romulus Scott. Unfortunately, we do not have a picture of Charles Romulus Scott. However, he was a man of means from Chatham County. He was a town commissioner. There likely has to be a picture of him somewhere. We just haven't found it, so the hunt continues. He was born in Chatham County in 1831 and married Susanna, quote unquote, Anna Yates, who was the daughter of Eli Yates. This is of particular importance, I mentioned it to me, because three of his Eli's sons were Carlos, Alvis, and Ferris. Ferris Yates, if you know Yates Mill in Raleigh, Ferris Yates ran Yates Mill. Alvis Yates was actually my great-grandfather, so a little connection there, family out in Chatham County. So, he was a farmer, a cattle raiser, and for 18 years, county commissioner in Williams Township in Chatham County, which has since been absorbed by the southern part of Durham metro area. But even when he owned the house, cattle drivers would stop there as well. He started in 1890 in Chatham County, a Cattle Growers Association club. So even before he moved to Cary, it was well known with cattle ranchers. So it makes sense that once he had moved to Cary, he would allow them also to camp on his ground. Now it's unclear exactly why, but in 1898 he moved to Cary and he bought the Ivey-Ellington house. The picture we're seeing here obviously are not from when he was there. The picture on the left, when he came to town, he set up Scott & Sons Dry Goods and Grocery. So you can see, I'll use the pointer again, the Ivey-Ellington house on the right. These two brick buildings are still there. The one to the side, which is now gone, was actually Scott & Sons Grocery and Dry Goods. So he had to walk from just off frame here across to, and then to work where it was. So again, 1898, he moved here. So eventually, it stopped being a grocery store and was just a dry goods store. And interesting, also it became the town's first millinery, a hat shop, because his son, C.W., married a teacher at Cary Academy who was also a hat maker. So you can see how this will all come together. In 1906, 1907, that he and his son, C.W., were listed as stockholders in Cary High School before it was sold. So he was definitely involved in the town. In addition to running the store, however, C.R. worked as a property tax assessor here in Cary, which means that he would go out and he'd assess property. It's worth this amount of money, you have to pay X amount of taxes. There was a scandal in 1900 when he and the other tax assessors were accused of lowering tax value property to stave off money, to keep the town from getting the revenue that they were deserved. It went to trial, it was an investigation, and during the ensuing investigation, they were all exonerated, they were all cleared. But part of the questioning went like this. The prosecutor asked him about his own house here in Cary, which again was the Ivey-Ellington house. He said, well, what was your house valued at? Yes. Well, mine's an older house, it's worth about $600. And the prosecutor asked, well, what sort of house is it? Scott replied, it's the ugliest house in Cary. So apparently Scott was not a fan of the Gothic revival style. He died in 1919 and is buried out in Mount Pisgah, just over the Chatham line into Chatham County. Now, Joseph Smith bought the house after he owned it for about a year. And really, that's what we know. He bought the house, owned it for about less than a year, and was gone. But Cary in 1920, when the next person to buy the house, was still a very rural town. So let's take a quick side tour and talk about what Cary was like in 1920. The picture on the top is from the Cary High School girls basketball team, the 1920 yearbook. And what we're looking at is the Breeze house behind it and all of the open space around it. This is 1920. I mean, Cary at that time was still very much a rural town. Notice there's two barns back there in town. People had barns, people had livestock, people still had horses. Not everybody had a car, a lot of people still had horses. Just to the right in the picture is the Adolphus Jones house, and just off frame is Dr. Templeton's house, which sat about where the track is. If you go around Cary Elementary School now, there's a little playground where the kids sat. To get where this picture was taken now, you would probably be just about where the fly tower is, maybe a little past that behind the Cary Elementary School. But there's the Breeze house from 2016. And one of the reasons I like to show this picture, honestly, not only to talk about how open it was and how much of a rural town it was, is I really love that house. And I was really upset when they tore it down about a year and a half ago to build the Arley, whatever, commercial broker, commercial real estate office. That was a wonderful, wonderful example of a post-Civil War house that did not survive. And I love the fellow there in what looks like his overalls, walking out across while the girls are playing basketball. So even the next guy to buy the house is John Harrison Ellington, and even when he bought the house in 1920, it had a long way to go from becoming a rural a town like this to a more modern town. Let's talk about the Ellingtons a little bit though. Like Scott, we do not have a picture of John Harrison Ellington. In fact, he owned the house for quite some time, as you can see, almost 30 years, but not a lot is known about him. Things that we do know, he was born in Chatham County in 1875. He died in Durham in 1943. He married Bessie Tallulah Salmons around 1906, but was divorced in the 1930s. Unknown for sure when he moved to Cary, but in the 1910 census, he listed his occupation as railroad hand and place of residence as Cary, North Carolina. When he registered for the draft in the First World War, 1918, he listed his home as Cary, North Carolina, and business as a serviceman for J.B. Cook and Company in Cary. He owned several properties in town, not just the Ivey-Ellington. And we can infer that he rented the Ivey-Ellington. He owned it as a rental unit even when he lived in town. You can see from the picture on the left, there is the transfer from Joseph Smith to J.H. Ellington and Cary for $10 and other consideration. If you look at deeds from that time, it'll often say $10 and other considerations. So cash on the side, horses, whatever you had for other considerations. But 2 years later, he had two other houses for sale on Chatham Street. If you look at the deeds from this period, if you know where a perfect piece is on Chatham Street, there were two lots there at the time. He owned both of those lots. So we have to assume perhaps there were houses there that he owned as well. So things we do know also, that several of his kids are listed in the yearbooks at Cary High in the 1920s as students, so he certainly lived here as kids. We know that one of his sons, Royce Ellington, was working as a volunteer firefighter in Cary in 1927 when the West Side Inn caught fire and burned. They were able to save the inn, but the inn set over where the Fidelity Bank is now. There was the Walker Hotel here and the West Side Inn over there competing for people coming off the train, the two hotels. By the 1930 census, John Harrison Ellington was living in Greenville, South Carolina, so they'd already moved. But his family owned the Ivey-Ellington for another 16 years or so. In fact, he died in 43. His family, 1943, his family owned it for a couple more years before they were either just decided or forced to sell it. When H.H. Waddell bought the house in 1946, and like I say, his family owned it for over 60 years. But before we talk about H.H. Waddell, let's take another little sidebar. Let's take a little sidebar and talk this little interesting piece of Cary history. This is the entire Cary phone book from 1930. There are some interesting things to notice here. That there is not a listing for Ellington in 1930. So there was not a phone in the Ivey-Ellington at that time. But there were things that we can talk about. The people who recently had owned the house, the Ivey, Thaddeus Ivey, he had a phone number. The guy who was about to buy the house, H.H. Waddell, had a phone. There were not one, not two, but three doctors, Dr. Yarborough, Dr. Templeton, and Dr. Hunter. We had three doctors in a town of 500 people. So, in fact, if you know, Dr. Hunter's house is the craftsman-style bungalow on Academy Street. You're heading toward the high school. It's the last one on the left. And if you've ever eaten a Serendipity Cafe, that was Dr. Hunter's office. He built that as his doctor's office when he worked just down the street. Dr. Yarborough worked and lived in the White House. That's across the street from the Mr. Ivey house. As I said earlier, the Templeton house, Dr. Al, that one is long gone. One thing I do like to see is that the lowest number in town is 2. Reached the high school, dial 2. Clearly that was their most important building in town. Even had to dial 8 just to get to the police department, but just to get it to. So it's kind of neat that back in 1930, there were the post office is now. There was two little houses there. One of the houses that sat there was where the operators sat and lived. There were rooms in there they worked. And this is not quite Mayberry, but it's pretty close. You just pick up the phone, say, Central, get me whoever. And they would connect you to whoever. You know, Central, get me the mayor, get me whoever. And they would connect you for it, which is pretty cool. But let's look back to H.H. Waddell, who bought the house in 1946. If you could Google 1950s businessman, I think this is the picture that would come up. There's so much to love about this picture. The tie, the suit, the tight hair, the horn-rimmed glasses. The calendar on the back says March of 1953. So H.H. at this point was already living in the house. Again, just love that picture. By the time he bought the house in 46, so he was already a very prominent citizen of Cary. We saw before 1930, he had a phone, so he's living in town, had a phone. He was born in Ellington in 1895. He moved to Cary in 1917 when he was hired to manage and work as a mechanic in an auto garage. He joined the Navy in 1918, was out in 1919 after the war ended, and married Nanny Waldo, reopened his garage and ran it until 1927. He has the distinction of being the first appointed fire chief in Cary. In 1923, he was appointed fire chief. In 1929, a year before the phone book, he was elected mayor, served mayor for 4 years, and after mayor, served 2 terms as town commissioner. So this is all before he bought the house in 46. In the late 30s and early 40s, he worked for Glenn Hobby of Hobby's Appliances here in town, was appointed a local judge in 1949, held that position for 9 years. Started in 1960, he served a 4-year term on town council. So all through life, he was very active in politics of Cary. He died in 1975 and is buried out in Hillcrest, like a lot of people on this list are. Why he is significantly important to the house, however, is that he was the first one to make major changes to the house in the lifetime of the house. He was the one that added the little kitchen off the back to modernize the house a little bit, added an indoor bathroom and back in there as well. So finally, by the 1950s, there's indoor plumbing in the house, and then water, there's a bathroom, and there's the kitchen, so there's indoor cooking. But before we take a closer look at the changes he made, let's take a little bit of sidebar. Now, I'm not inferring ages from you, but was anybody in here living in North Carolina in 1954? This is a young group, so, but I'll often say that if you were living in North Carolina in 1954, then you remember Hazel. Hurricane Hazel, 1954. It was at the time and remains the strongest hurricane ever to hit North Carolina. It's the only Category 4 hurricane ever to strike North Carolina directly. Wow. It is the furthest north a Category 4 hurricane has ever struck. When it struck, it had the terrible misfortune of arriving during the seasonal high tide. There were 18-foot storm surges were measured at Calabash. 30-foot waves were measured at Calabash. 120-mile-per-hour gusts were also recorded. By the time it passed over Wake County, it was still a borderline Category 1, Category 2 hurricane. And it was a very fast-moving hurricane. Within 12 hours of making landfall, it was in southern Canada. I mean, it was moving quickly. It was a fast-moving storm. You look at the rain totals. It didn't drop a lot of rain because it moved really, really fast, but it was very strong. There were 19 deaths in North Carolina. There were over 1,000 attributed to the storm. Most of them were in Haiti, where there was a very poor preparation for it. Property damage in North Carolina was estimated at $136 million in 1954 dollars, which is about $1.5 billion in 2023 dollars. And why this is important to us is that sadly, the Ivey-Ellington was not spared by Hurricane Hazel.
Wow.
So remember the picture overhead of the church looking type. This whole front section just peeled off the front of the house. Also interesting to note that if you look to the side, about where the Maton is now is where the town water tower was. And so when the picture was taken, it was still there. If there's any car buffs like me, the one on the left is a 1949 Chevy style side, which was their first truly modern production car after the war. It's a great car. The one on the right is a 1950 Oldsmobile Delta 88. They're fabulous cars. I figure there's somebody else's car. So while at the same time that H.H. Waddell is having to repair the front, he's adding the bathroom, the kitchen, and the bathroom off the back. To me, the most interesting part of this picture is this section right there. Because if you look at the roof line, there's a dormer on the roof. And so does that mean there was a dormer on that front part of the roof? There's not one there now, but it looks like that perhaps when the house had been original, that there was a dormer there. Now, when H.H. Waddell decided to rebuild the house, he did not replace the gable off the front. He simply snugged it up to the front of the house, took the window off the front, and snugged it back up. So let's take a look at what that looked like. Now, be very clear. This is not a before Hazel picture. This is a picture of the reconstruction that happened around 2000, but it was reconstructed to look like what the memory of the fellow did reconstructed. This is what it looked like, he said, before Hazel. So they noticed that the big gable on the front, here's the gable ripped off. When H.H. Waddell decided to redo it, he just took that away completely and just snugged it back up to the front. It is not two different doors going up. This is a reverse mirror image, I believe, of what the picture of the house was at the time. So you see, it was the first major renovation to the house. You kept the front stoop, but removed the whole porch area as well. And again, as far as you know, inside, other than removing the room from above the porch, the inside did not really change. A little bit more about the Waddells. This is the house around 1980. By the late 1960s, the Waddell family was no longer living in the house, they were renting it out. A lot of folks, as the parents got older, the parents will own the house, but they rented it out. In 1972, H.H. Waddell deeded the house to his two daughters, Eva and Melba. He died in 1973, the house passed to them, and he's buried over in Hillcrest. In 1984, one daughter, Melba, sold her interest to her sister Eva and Eva's husband, Jefferson Suggs. Eva died in 1987, and the house passed to her husband, Jeff. And Jeff continued to lease it out into the late 1990s when he did remodel to make it look more like it really did. The changes that he also did included adding a bathroom on the side. Remember the picture from above that had a little pitch off to the side? Jefferson Suggs added that. Added some more modern plumbing, did basically a restoration without changing the footprint and the floor plan inside. He did an upgrade of the house and began renting it out commercially. So at this point, around 2000, people aren't living in it anymore. It's become a commercial property. But it's worth mentioning Jefferson Suggs. He's a very interesting fellow. There he is. I love the mustache and the cap. He served in the Navy in World War II, where he was a first-class boatswain mate on LCIL, that's Landing Craft Infantry L, number 401, that participated in D-Day. Other than just being a generic picture of D-Day, that is Landing Craft 401. So somewhere on that boat, 19-year-old Jeff Suggs is helping Marines and Army infantry get to the beach at Omaha Beach on June 6th, 1944. I think that's pretty interesting. I like that a lot. But he had been born in Smithfield in 1924. After the war, he settles in Cary, marries the Waddell daughter, graduated from NC State in 1951, and go back. So thank you. Worked as a land developer in Cary in the 50s and 60s. So a remodel of the house that he did in 2000 is pretty much up his alley. In fact, since I gave this talk the first time, continue to look around, I discovered that in 1956, he bought a plot of land over in the Russell Hills area from Russell Heater, who was developing it, built the house, and sold it to the Lewis family, which then I bought about 5 years ago. So he actually is the guy that built my house, which I didn't know when I bought it. I think that's kind of neat. So after his death in 2010, the house was placed in a trust, and the town of Cary bought it in 2011. Another interesting thing about him developing land in Cary was that in the 1980s, he worked to save the Lane Bennett house, which was the one house on quite a bit of acreage of land over by Kokobu and the Waverly area. The house built in 1775, and he actually sold it to a lady for $1 because she agreed to pick it up and move it. And it sits now over at, I'll say this correctly, 7408 Ebenezer Church Road. And she picked the house up piece by piece. She didn't take the whole house. She took the house apart, took it back over there, had it rebuilt and restored, and is still a house where somebody lives today, which is pretty cool. And you know the thing that Jeff, if you know the food line on Kildare Farm Road at corner of Maynard, Jeff developed that land and built that food line. He was quite a land developer. So the date on this is wrong. Cary Farmers Market existed there from 2014 to 2022. I had the date wrong. But 2011 was when the town acquired the property. And the Farmers Market existed there until at least 2022 when they moved the Farmers Market over to where the Perfect Peace is now. Eventually the Farmers Market will move to the new downtown Cary Park, but for a while it was there. A quick note, if you look at pictures of the Ivey-Ellington over the years, sometimes it has a green roof, sometimes it doesn't. And I really don't know the timescape there of when it was green and when it was not green. I know originally it was wood shake. It was not a metal roof. When the house was built, it was wood shake. Part of the restoration that the town will do is apparently to put wood shake back. Now the question is, why save it? I'm going to borrow a phrase from one of the ladies. The lady that gave the talk about the Nancy Jones house, Carla. What do we have to lose? I mean, it's a 150-year-old house. That, in my opinion, makes it worth a loan. worth saving. But as it turns out, there are many other reasons why it's worth saving. I'm going to read directly from the 2008 National Register of Historic Places application that was submitted. It says, the Ivey-Ellington is significant because it is a quote-unquote rare example of Gothic Revival cottage architecture in Wake County. Few examples of Gothic Revival style appear in the county, and most of them are religious structures. Located near the former Raleigh and Chatham Railroad and constructed in the 1870s, the Ivey-Ellington house demonstrates the diffusion of style and ideas from urban to rural areas. It exemplifies national trends in housing reform and the popularity of architectural pattern books in the late 19th century. So that alone is a significant house just because of what it is. There's actually one other example of a 19th century Gothic Revival house in all of Wake County. So in terms of Cary, it's important to Cary history. We've had a mayor live there, the Iveys lived there, the Scotts. Important people from the town have lived there over the years. As more and more development happens in downtown, this is just me stepping on a soapbox, I think it's important to say what 19th century structures we can. When Frank Page laid out the town, he took the depot, basically, he was going to build, so basically the Bradford's Ordinary, went a half mile north, south, east, and west, and that square mile became Cary. In that square mile, there are less than 10 19th century houses and building structures left. And certainly, this is one of them, and it's worth saving. The others are the building we're in, the Page Walker, the S.P. Walder House, which is the other Gothic Revival 19th century house in Cary. If you know the Maiden Inn, there's a little white house behind it. That was Dr. Walder's house. That is the only other 19th century Gothic Revival house in Wake County. They're now across the street from each other. Now, there are other 19th century Gothic Revival style buildings. There are churches in Raleigh. The church that Meow built out in the Shotwell area is still there. But these are the only two houses in Wake County. So there's this house, the Walker House, the Walker Hotel, the S.P. Walder House, the Guest Oval House, the Pink House is one. The Esther Ivey, the Raven House we talked about, her house is one. The Sam Jones House, which is where MC Restaurant is, on the corner of Academy and Drive. The Passmore House, which is now the Cotton House. You can go and get a pint there. The Marcus Baxter Dry House, which is the one across the street from the MC Restaurant. It's where Professor Dry, Principal Dry lived while he was the head of Cary County. It's a little gray one-story right on the corner. And this doesn't really count, but I'll count it anyway. The interior frame of the First Methodist Church, which is still under all the brick, was a 19th century structure. When they bricked the church, they just bricked the outside. They didn't tear down the existing. In fact, if you look at the church, there are little wooden supports that come out of the brick, and that's the original part you can see from the structure, which is pretty cool. Now, there's a house in the corner of Dixon and Chatham that may also be, it lists its build date as 1900, so there could be some leeway in there, I'm not sure exactly. But if it was going to be saved, it had to be moved. And somebody would ask, well, why did it have to be moved? Because for 10 years, Northwood Development Properties have been trying to redevelop that corner between where Harrison and Chatham fits. And so there was a lot of back and forth discussion and dealing and wheeling that went on, and eventually decided that they're going to build apartments there. And so that meant the house had to be moved. It was going to be saved. So on February 20th of this year, the house was moved. I took these pictures from right in front of the Baptist church. Those who might appreciate these geek kind of things, there was no truck that pulled it. There's a fellow right there with basically an iPad that's driving the wheels underneath, controlling it. It was pretty neat to see. Yeah, the big truck. And they could all operate independently and up and down and move. The first picture is it's rolling off the dirt onto Academy Street, coming up Academy Street, and then you can just see the high school up at the end. I love the pictures in the middle, because there's the Ivey-Ellington house, there is the Guest Oval house, and there's Dr. Yarberg's house, all in one picture for the first and only time ever. That's not an aerial shot. It took a lot of planning to get this done. And it was quite an event. Now, obviously, the town, the roads were closed, they had to cut down trees, they moved down power lines. It was quite an event. On moving day, these people came to see the house move, very interesting. It is left to right of the back row, Cheryl Ivey Salmon, Jane Patrick Cassie, Betty Patrick Worley, Vicki Ivey behind, and kneeling is Jennifer Worley. The four ladies on the top are all great-granddaughters of Thaddeus and Mary Ivey that came to see their great-grandfather's house move. In fact, the lady on the right, Vicki Ivey behind, get a lot of the pictures that I've used here and a lot of the pictures that I didn't use. She very graciously donated to the friends to use. So really thanks to them for coming out. It was fun to see. But so now that it's been moved, what next? This is a conceptual picture of Withers Ravenel, the company that's been hired to do some of the renovations. Clearly, it's obviously an artist's rendering what it could look like. It's missing windows, it's missing dormers. It's just kind of a generalized picture of this happy fountain-looking area. Cary loves fountains these days. That it might look like. In the spring of 22, they were trying to decide where to put the house. And there was, again, a lot of talk about where this house would go. Everywhere from tucked over behind the dumpsters, behind Blue Moon, to where it ended up, maybe over on Harrison. There was a lot of moving parts. In my opinion, if it couldn't stay where it was, where it ended up was probably the best location you can get, right front and center on Academy Street. By the winter of 22-23, they were preparing their location site in 23. In February 23, the house was moved. By the spring, they had begun the rehabilitation work. The scoping work and what the rehabilitation would take. That is ongoing. No actual preservation work has begun. They are still trying to figure out exactly what to do. So we've got it. What work really needs to be done? They're taking their time with it. The estimates from the town is that it will take 18 months once they decide what to do to actually get it done. So we're shooting in, I'll say now, mid-2024, but hopefully if you ever worked on an old house, there's always something that comes up. It's never as easy as you'll think. This is how it looks today. So some exterior work has been done to secure the house and build the new foundation. Things that for sure will happen is that it will become ADA compliant. We'll add 2 new bathrooms. If the upstairs become ADA compliant, I'm not sure how that's going to work because it's a very tight little turn stairway, so maybe only the ground floor will be ADA compliant. I'm not really sure. One interesting thing is that the door is clearly not original. That's a mid-century modern door that was tacked on at some point. But part of the removal of the house process was that white oak that's as old as the house sat out in front had to be taken down, and that wood has been sourced, and a door will be made from that wood for the new front. The current plan from the town of Cary is that the new downtown park across the street will have a lot of people who need office space, and 5 or 6 of them will go in there. So it will be office space. So personally, I don't think that's the best use, but at least the house has been safe. And we'll take that for what we will. But again, the ultimate end use is still up to date. There are people that I know in the town who are really pushing for it to become basically a downtown Cary museum. It'd be very nice if Cary had a dedicated museum. Up on the 3rd floor of this building, there is what is now the Cary Museum, and it's in a room maybe 2/3 of this size. But down in the basement, there are so many artifacts and interesting things that could be displayed. There's just not room to display them. So, if this became a museum, perhaps we could display some more of that really fun stuff. So, one of the project managers who worked on the move is a lady named Jillian White, and she works also with the Historic Preservation Commission. And when I asked her to give an official statement, she gave me this, so I'll read it to you word for word. She said, "I like to always note that we can't understand where we are going if we don't understand where we come from. We, Cary, respect our past so we can learn and adapt for a better future. Cary is very much committed to our historic and cultural resources, and we will continue working to better our community, ensuring that we use our resources wisely to protect and share our important history." So, and from speaking with her, I know that her vote would be the Town of Cary Museum, but she's a low-level worker like me, so we'll see what comes out of that. So we'll end with this. If you know who Jerry Miller was, he's an artist here in Cary, maybe most known as the guy who, about 46 years ago, decided to have a little arts and crafts festival in the hottest week of the year and have it in downtown Cary. And Jerry's still with us, and he is an absolute treasure. He is true. There's a bust of him outside Cary High School, if you look at it, see a nice sculpture. He's a fabulous guy. And one of the things he's also, if you ever see pen and ink drawings of pretty much anything around Cary, you can bet money that Jerry drew them at some point. And this is one that he drew of the Ivey-Ellington showing the original thatch roof and chimneys. You may have noticed from one of the earlier pictures that the chimneys are long gone. There's no reason to have chimneys. The fireplace was there with acrylic ornamental. Nobody's having a fire in there anymore, but the chimneys are long gone. So that's pretty much what I've got. If you've got questions, I'll answer any question except what the town plans to do with it, because I've told you what I know. And anything else would be just wild guessing and hearsay. So that's what I got. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.